It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, it's 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Anyway, greetings, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID live stream, Series 5, Episode 5, that makes it number 29, goes live here. So, after another frenetic week, Coinbase has been down a third and is now only down about 20% from the all-time highs as we await its results. Presumably those results are going to be good enough to dilute the current price-earnings ratio of 475. It's been bobbing around the Coinbase stock in Young's pyramid during the course of the week. As we showed you a couple of weeks ago, it debuted at number 1, a bit like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and has thereafter undergone a rather tortured time, a bit like Frankie Goes to Hollywood. At the bottom of tier 1 in undiluted form, fully priced even with options, it's somewhere in the middle right now. I mean, no matter how you approach every options, warrant and Harry, it comes out a bit, maybe a bat squeak behind Hong Kong exchanges at the top of the pyramid as I speak in a fluid and dynamic market. Speaking of fluid and dynamic markets, 30-year Treasury money in the United States of America is hovering around 2.25%. Oh, the yield of it all. While the Bitcoin price we didn't actually manage to look at before we went live for at least 15 minutes, so we can confidently say its price is somewhere between 0 and infinity as usual. All this and more has been covered in greater detail in Exchange Invest Daily, the unique newsletter of the Bourse business. If you'd like to be a subscriber, send us an email or hit me up on social media, Patrick L. Young. Make a mention wherever you see this on social media, and we'll organize for you to get a free 30-day trial so you too can get signed up to have a better understanding of the exchange business. Welcome to all our streams today. Don't forget, please give us a little bit of a like. That would really help, because then that means that the artificial intelligence bots will push us forward and up the ranking so that our illustrious guests can manage to get more viewers. Speaking of illustrious guests, our guest today is Christopher Messina. The man from Messy Times has returned. Chris, as you may recall, was our very, very first guest 28 shows ago. He's a board member of North American Nickel, which is listed in Toronto Stock Exchange's Vancouver department, amongst other mining companies. He's a markets-focused executive and entrepreneur. He's got deep international experience in the global capital markets, private equity, technology, and commodities. He's the co-founder and CEO, we talked a lot about this last time around, actually, I do believe, CrowdFill LLC, and an advisor to Digital Gamma, which is the first prime brokerage service for professional traders to access cryptocurrency markets, which it seems are still a thing. He began his fintech career as part of the team that created BrokerTec. That takes us back in the world of bonds at Goldman Sachs, perhaps appropriately for financial markets, as I've noticed before. Chris holds that qualification that is best for particularly the world of exchanges and indeed the world of old-fashioned floor markets and interdealer brokers, money markets et al. He has an AB in Anthropology from the University of Chicago, as well as an MBA in Finance and Strategy from the Australian Graduate School of Management, presumably so he can do something like become an anthropologist in a future career. He's been a contributing author to Shari'ah Compliant Private Equity, a primer for the executive, which was published by Euromoney in 2010, has lectured on derivatives, hedge funds, Sharia finance, and artificial intelligence at law schools and conferences globally. And most importantly, as I said, he was a guest previously. So, Chris, the man from Messy Times, you return. Good afternoon. Where in the world are you today?
Good afternoon. Just listening to that recitation makes me feel tired, Patrick. I am here in the last free state in America, Florida, enjoying the sunshine and freedom, and looking forward to a good conversation. I'm delighted to be back.
Wonderful to hear from you. I do believe actually you've also got one of England's most famous disciples of recent times has just spent a fortnight in St. Martin, and I believe that earlier today we saw Nigel Farage was in Florida. I think he was meeting your governor just the other day, and he met some other guy who lives on a golf club these days and is kind of semi-reclusive, whoever that man might be. Lovely to see you this evening if you're watching. Former President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump, just in case you're catching something before your afternoon golf game. So you're in Florida once again. What's been happening in the world? I mean, the last time we met, my goodness, that seemed an eon ago. I mean, America was still free and all those sorts of things. And there's been some sort of an election since then.
Well, there has been, and and Nigel, if you're listening, you're sitting there with President Trump. Please say hello. I had the joy of chatting with Nigel at London Mines and Money a few years back. Funny guy, spot on. Yeah, we had an election in typical American fashion, at least for the last few election cycles. Half the country believed that it was legitimate. Half the country believes it was illegitimate. There's lots of screaming and yelling. There's huge amounts of theatrics going on, and part of what my co-host and we set up this podcast, Messy Times, in the middle of last year, mainly to provide a little clarity. I mean, the tagline is that we're going to tell you who's lying to you and why. And right now, so far as I can tell, 99% of politicians and 99.9994% of the media have been lying to people consistently, which kind of mirrors the coronavirus statistics. So if there's anything to be drawn from that, I don't know.
Interesting. What you can hear in the background is the ice cream van is just passing by. I hadn't realized it was controlled by the Biden administration or the FBI, but clearly somebody is trying to silence the man from Messy Times.
Most likely.
Yeah, it's very lively altogether. It could get us into that whole conversation about the regulation of ice cream vans. I can tell you this one's playing on a UK-based cycle because it's right-hand drive and imported from the UK. Whereas, fortunately, it's not in somewhere like, I do believe, some of the Middle Eastern states where you can literally play that annoying jingle for as long as you want, which, well, yeah, certainly, I think it'd be put off ice cream by the time I'd finished it. Enough of this commodity. What's going on in the world of commodities these days? It's been quite busy, hasn't it?
It has been, and part of what I've found most fascinating for the last, certainly watching this cycle happen in the last few years, is that a lot of the predictions about, or a lot of the currents that we see at my team growing towards greater high-tech manufacturing, distributed energy, modular grids, all sorts of things are driving towards huge needs for minerals that most people haven't heard of, right? So you've got people who play the copper market or iron, things like rare earths and tellurium and niobium have become a lot more, at least popular for journalists to pretend to write about, to fill column space and provide some sort of insight, such as it is. But many of the new tools that we're going to be relying upon require all sorts of things that people have only heard about tangentially. And one of the core tenets to what we're building, I'm the chief strategy advisor to a massive rare earths mine in South Greenland, is that when we're talking to investors and people who are looking to get into this market or be a participant in critical minerals markets, if you've gotten yourself a time series from one of the data sources and they've taken a look at backwards looking demand and supply, and they're making some projections going forward, in our mind, that's great. That's a starting point. But if you believe in anything other than a sharp, psychotically steep hockey stick in demand for almost all of these materials, our investment is not for you, right? If you believe that there's kind of 15% CAGR or 8% CAGR, or play with your happy little Monte Carlo models, go do something else. Because if you don't believe that there is a radical transformation of the technological landscape coming, then keep investing in railroads.
Interesting. Of course, there's been quite a lot of bidding wars going on for old-fashioned American railroads just recently, with the Canadians launching bids, et cetera, et cetera. But so talk just a little bit about rare earths, because I don't really think anybody understands what they are. I mean, I'm just about able to get to the end of the metals that they put into racing cars, and you reach sort of unobtainium or something, which is a flashpoint of like 1,000,000 degrees and then burns like a supernova, and it basically weighs nothing. But rare earths, what exactly do they do, and why are they so important?
Well, here's why it's so important, and for those people who stumbled through high school chemistry and were exhausted at the end, we're gonna give the primer version of this. You don't have to hurt your head further. For those of friends of mine who majored in physical chemistry, they'll be appalled at the analogy I'm going to give. But if you look at the lanthanide series, you remember the picture of the periodic table, which is the last one in a series of attempts to organize the elements in a rational fashion. Even then, you'll see that you have to pull out two series from the families of elements, and one of those is the lanthanides. And part of the reason they're so tricky from a production standpoint is that if you remember those simplistic diagrams of electron shells around the atom, right? If you remember that from even your high school years, higher up in the table, like H2O, it's fairly simple to break the bonds of hydrogen and oxygen. It's not that hard because they have fewer rings, smaller rings. So by breaking or moving an electron, you're actually not doing the energy required is not nearly so much as it is to break apart atoms when they're higher up in the periodic table. The lanthanides are very far down, and therefore they're very chemically similar to one another, which makes it tricky, a bit of a science, a bit of an art, in order to provide the conditions under which you can separate lanthanum from cerium, from praseodymium, from samarium.
I think Chris may have frozen there. There obviously aren't enough rare earths in his system right at the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching this live, do please take the time to leave us a comment, even if it's just sympathy about the fact that we're not managing to get our way through the periodic table with Chris at this juncture. By all means, we would love to hear from you. We always appreciate your likes and good comments, and indeed your constructive criticism as well. Whatever you'd like to, if you want to ask Chris a question when he returns in a moment, by all means, line that up and we'll be very, very happy to talk to you. And in the meantime, don't forget, you can check out Exchange Invest at exchangeinvest.com, which is the daily newsletter of the Bourse Business. It's published by myself, and of course, we're right on top of all of the major topics that go on in financial markets and the financial market space. Equally, if you're here and watching this show, we've got, good grief, an archive now of 29 different shows. The first one featured just yours truly, talking about the landscape of the world. And thereafter, we've gone through all manner of market structure with a plethora of great guests. The first one was indeed Christopher Messina, who's with us this evening, and we have been followed up by a number of different parties in the universe of financial markets, and indeed also in the greater parish of exchanges. And thank you very much, Jeffrey Eisenberg. Yes, Chris is frozen over in Florida, climate change at work. Who knows what could be at work here? Could it possibly be a nefarious operative from the Democratic Party that's managed to do in perhaps the fan of his computer? I don't know. Hopefully Chris is going to be back with us in just a couple of minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Recently, highlights on the Exchange Invest weekly cadre from this IPO-VID live stream have included the Sheriff of the City of London, Michael Manelli. We also had a great discussion about Brexit a week before that, which was with a fellow professor and a Mercer, the professor at Gresham College, which was Daniel Hodson. He was, of course, the former chief executive of the Life Exchange, and he was one of many parties who we've had great conversations with, lively conversations with during the course of this series. And thank you once again, Jeffrey Eisenberg, for your comment. I'm not sure where you are in the world, but clearly you haven't managed to yet lose it. Oh, and we've got a question I see coming in from several people. Thank you, Chris Pryor. That's a great question. We're going to put to Chris in just a couple of minutes about the Suez Canal. We're going to equally take Randy Kowalski. Mr. Kowalski, it's lovely to see you, asking about, that's going to be very interesting. We'll be asking about monetary policy in a minute and the Fed's activities. That gives us an interesting eye into something that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes, which is actually Chris's new book, which he has just finished writing and is in production. We've even got a sneak view of the cover, which I believe we'll be able to show you slightly later on. And at the same time, thank you very much, David Fenn. I agree completely with your comment, which is why we're missing him so on the show at the moment. This is David Fenn notes, Christopher is always an innovative and provocative anthropologist. I totally agree. And isn't it interesting how in this age of financial markets being obsessed with quants and pointy-headed rocket scientists, mathematicians, how many creative and interesting people happen to have come from the current generation and the previous generations of financiers over time. Whereas nowadays we seem to have all got very, very hyper-mathematical, something to do with perhaps a big data universe. It'd be interesting to see how that changes over time and how we can discuss that. Because we were looking at data and the sovereign individual just a few shows back with Colin Howard, who was on giving us a very, very interesting discussion about the world of data, the individual's own possibility of looking after their persona and so on. And that was echoed then the following week when we had Sandra Rowe talking from the Global Blockchain Business Organization, the Global Blockchain Business Council, which was a handy refresher on not just what DLT can do for you, but I suppose what we can do for your DLT, to paraphrase John F. Kennedy, if only he'd lived in the digital world. So, ladies and gentlemen, our guest at the moment is sadly not with us, a little bit like Toby the Pug over my shoulder. I hope that certainly, unlike Toby the Pug, who's no longer with us largely because he's dead, that's not befallen Chris, and it's just he's having some sort of a computer problem. I don't believe the weather outlook was too bad. And here he is, he's returned.
Wow.
Chris, the great news is you've got a queue of questions awaiting you, so you can race through the periodic table and finish, and we're ready. Your fan base awaits you. They were extremely stressed at your non-appearance for a while.
I tell you, well, clearly the Biden unity government has exercised their internet kill switch on my connection. So well done, boys, but I found a workaround, which I'm not going to share. It'll take them at least 45 minutes to figure out that one. So apologies for that. Apologies for that. Where did we drop off? I was in the middle
we dropped off, and you were essentially talking about the shells of neutrons, and I suppose at that point in time I can make that very English joke about neutrons, protons, croutons. You were talking about those sorts of things, and you were in the middle of the periodic table about double L and somewhere there, and you were just discussing to us the importance of rare earths.
All right, excellent. Well, very quickly, without going back through all that again. On the production side, that just means from a miner standpoint and a processor standpoint, it's a little bit trickier to separate out each individual rare earth oxide or yttrium from solution, much like the palladium, rhodium, and platinum group are also very hard to separate individually. So that just makes it a little harder to deal with. But when it comes to the industrial applications and why this matters so much is that you've got this very fascinating supply-demand curve imbalance. Everyone has read about the time that aluminum at one point was more expensive per ounce than gold because it was a lost secret as to how to actually produce it. And then the Roman emperor who first found it decided to put the eyes out of the chemists who did it, thus losing it to the West for another 1,500 years. So good going, Rome. But right now, if you've got the idea of, say, Alcoa wants to create a brand new aluminum alloy that will be much more strong or light or have other properties that are desirable in terms of industrial applications, mobile applications. You've got this very strange place where we talk to, from a commodity sales perspective, we talk to end users and we have discussions with engineers about what we call the platonic ideal of their design, right? So if you say to an engineer, what's the best way to make a high power density motor, or what's the best way to make a turbine that will sit in salt air and high temperatures, the rest of it, engineers will come up with an ideal mix of the materials that will go into that design. But then you then say to them, as their CFO and the chief operating officer are most surely going to say, well, that's fascinating, but 7 of the things that you have put down here that you need 7 pounds of each are way too expensive and very hard to find. We can't get them in those volumes, so pick another solution. And that is what happens in industrial design, and part of what we're trying to do is bridge that gap. We know that there are some incredibly attractive principles or properties of, say, a gadolinium aluminum alloy, for example, but there's not enough gadolinium produced on a global basis to address the sorts of massive applications that people want to use with that alloy. So part of what we're trying to manage is finding processing uses for the materials that we're producing that are currently low volume production, incredibly high cost. How do we move those up the volume scale, down the price scale, but still at a place that people want to buy? So that's the main goal that we're focused on. And I would just say that from your introduction, I've never stopped being an anthropologist, and the reason that anthropologists do well on Wall Street is that we pay attention to primate fear and greed and tribalism.
Actually, while you were off air, I was discussing exactly how suited it was and how interesting to discuss the whole concept of how this generation seems to be obsessed with people who are purely mathematical. I don't mean necessarily pure mathematicians, but purely mathematical quantity heads. And you look at kind of our generation and before, and people had a genuine cornucopia of backgrounds before they managed to hit financial markets. And I think there's something there. And certainly, I think your tribalism and primeval greed and fear point is well taken. Now, speaking of the fear end of the spectrum, well, first of all, thank you very much, David Fenn, for your excellent comment about anthropology. I think that's highly apt that Christopher is always an innovative and provocative anthropologist. I couldn't agree more. In your absence also, Jeffrey Eisenberg was saying, oh no, Chris, it froze over in Florida, climate change at work. So your fan cabal have been out very ready to make remarks about your brief demise there, thanks to whatever the conspiracy theory was that we're going with today with the man from Messy Times, Christopher Messina. Now, another Christopher Pryor-Williard, he's asked a great question. I mean, talking about primeval fear, just a few weeks ago, the world was about to end because the ever incredibly badly driven, or whatever that ship was called, the traffic jam in the Suez Canal put the spotlight on a key commodity on which many commodity exchanges depend but don't trade: freight. What has happened to the Baltic Exchange, and should we worry?
Wow, that's a good question, and I wish I had a more current answer. The Baltic Exchange worked really well for a while, and I knew that there were some issues coming into it a few years ago, but I honestly haven't paid attention. But yeah, freight, all sorts of logistics issues. I would hypothesize quickly, knowing that a lot of the folks I deal with who have to handle logistics for big commodity trading houses or for mining companies have moved to a lot of solutions that are more blockchain enabled or more, multilateral or bilateral in nature. So, good question about the Baltic Exchange. I would dive into it. I think in terms of should we worry overall about the state of global freight and contracting and transfers? No, I think, the people that need to get their stuff from A to B, do it. Are people going to look at choke points like the Suez Canal a lot more carefully than they did before? Possibly. But I would say on the optimistic note, because I responded to someone the other day who had written a fairly pessimistic report about the global state of the world, and he described the future as Hobbesian, which I kind of find pretty fascinating. I guess I'm a little more optimistic. I never thought of myself as a rosy glasses kind of guy, but we used to have far more hijackings and piracy and choke points in global trade than we do today. That could come back again. But the Suez Canal, I think, put people's noses out of joint so badly because that sort of disruption is now a surprise, where even 20 years ago, it wasn't that much of a surprise.
No, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, the whole situation, you look at the 1970s and how much friction there was, not just in terms of the actual terms of trade and the slowness of managing to communicate by 70 baud internet, which was effectively the telex machine, and you didn't even have a fax necessarily till the late 1970s. But also that whole cabal. I mean, you look at the things like Germany. I mean, you look at the Baader-Meinhof's terrorism. You look at the terrorism there was in Italy of the Red Brigades, which people just forget. And the amount of kidnapping, the things that were going on, all of which was an incredible restraint on trade as you were trying to get anywhere. And that's something which I think, I agree. I mean, people have forgotten just how difficult it was. Now what happens is, you get hashtag first world problems because everybody goes, oh my goodness, my AliExpress is stuck in the Suez Canal on ship number 4.
Right.
And then you have to sit there and you go, hold on a second. I mean, look how dark life was in 1970 or 75. I mean, look how, nowadays you can see where your car is on the high seas, on the container ship. You can even get onto a camera on the container on the high seas and see the container your car's in. It's just incredible.
Oh, a lot more transparency. Yeah, the run-up into the 1967 war was originally about restraint of trade and shutting down a waterway. True.
Shuttle Arab, wasn't it? That was the waterway that was disputed at the time. Absolutely true. But it's a great question, isn't it, from Chris Pryor-Williard? Thank you very much. I mean, Certainly, I think the development of freight markets is something that seems to be almost primeval. And in the current era where we're seeing a reopening and a difficulty prioritizing what goes where, it is quite fascinating. It's really, really interesting. Now, that's one area, but Randy Kowalski, he's asked a really superb question altogether. Now, it's a long one, so I'll take a deep breath before I start this one. Question for Christopher. Well, thank goodness it's not a question for me, having read it. Thank you, Randy. For the last 40 years, the Fed has engaged in extraordinary monetary creation and interest rate suppression, which has caused panics, booms, and busts. The markets have been blamed for these outcomes as opposed to the regulators and governments. This time around, with possibly $7 to $10 trillion worth of stimulus in the works, what will be the unintended consequences over the next decade?
A fine question, Mr. Kowalski. And I would say I'd skip to the end of that question and say unintended by whom or intended by whom. The Fed is a disaster and should be gotten rid of instantly. There's absolutely no reason on earth the Federal Reserve should continue to exist. It's nowhere in the Constitution, which sets monetary policy. It is a creation that was designed by banks to save themselves when things went wrong. And lo and behold, many years after their creation, it did just that. They practiced organized theft through managed inflation rather than just observing what happens. The $7 to $10 trillion of stimulus, the U.S. was bankrupt in November of 2019, right? Without any help of this coronavirus nonsense, and the resultant ham-fisted, tin-pot dictator draconian shutdowns that never made any sense. It's a fine question, right? We've discussed this before. You always look at cui bono, right? Mm-hmm. Who apparently there's a pack of politicians in this country that want to be king turd on crap mountain, and they look at Venezuela with envy. I've got no idea what rationale goes on in terms of the Fed. And when someone sets something up as this almighty being that's supposed to manage monetary policy, it pains me to the depths of my heart to have to look to one of my personal heroes, Richard Nixon, and accuse him of destroying the global system by taking us off the gold standard. Everything that's happened since then has been utterly insane. Every problem that government claims to fix, they make worse, right? Housing prices in the U.S. could not be where they are if we were still in a gold standard. That's just one great example. Before you set up Fannie and Freddie and all the other things that are busy creating money alongside the Fed, the official federal deficit right now is something like $32 trillion. But when you add in 45 years post New Deal baby boomer malfeasance in governmental control, we've got like $120 trillion of accumulated deficits and debt that we are never going to pay off without psychotically draconian taxation and or massive inflation, which is going to destroy the value of everyone's dollar. I bet the second is going to happen. And it's only a small miracle right now that the dollar still holds any value in world markets after this.
The wonders of exorbitant privilege. I mean, it's quite fascinating how the dollar has managed to hang in there. But it's funny, isn't it? Like, think about it. For the whole of our careers, pretty much people have been talking down the dollar. And yet there it is. It still hangs there. It's quite incredible. I suppose maybe that's Keynes. The market can manage to be wrong longer than you can stay solvent.
Well, it's also the fact that, if the world is graded on a curve, we're still doing better than many others, which is even more horrifying. But the world grant, it's like it's like handing over a credit card to a drunk teenager and then getting angry when he blows through the limit, right? It's just, it's madness, and it's somewhat disheartening, but I still have this abiding faith that at some point, rationality, clear thinking, and persuasive argumentation are going to hold the day in this country. I can't speak for others. But right now, the most fun I've had recently is in speaking to self-proclaimed Democrat friends of mine in DC and getting them to admit that there are parts of the Trump administration they miss. Not his crazy tweeting, not his getting into fights with Gold Star parents, but job creation, trying to rein in spending, the fact that if you promulgate any new rule in the Federal Register, you have to kill at least 3 to get the new one up. So he did a lot of really great things, but it's still impossible to get them to admit that they don't long for the days pre-Biden unity government.
Indeed, the Biden unity government. I wasn't aware of that phrase, but there you go. That's something that hasn't reached us in the rest of the Western world.
I'm trying to get it going. I think it's got good momentum because the acronym is bug. So that's
absolutely, yes, and possibly good for gold as well with the inflation they may yet unleash. So therefore has a double bug possibility, which is interesting. So therefore, I mean, you've just opined magnificently on all these sort of fascinating issues to do with the Federal Reserve, which, as you mentioned, is a very new central bank. I mean, that's the thing people don't remember. It's only formed barely 100 years ago, which is, like 50 years or 80 years after the Central Bank of Serbia, even the national bank. So I do believe that you're going to reveal to us the fact that you've been writing a book.
I have been, and if you ever want to get, what is that old? There it is. There for those of us who have not been in the publishing process. You get a look at the Sausage Factory. That's the cover art, which is almost done. And there's me on the left, demonstrating how I deal with swamp beasts in my daily life. So I was prompted to write this. Actually back when candidate Obama had not yet even been elected. And I always say to colleagues and to employees especially, I don't want to hear about a problem unless you've given some thought to the solution, right? If you come and with an obvious exception, if you find out that someone is stealing or committing fraud or insider trading, of course, come tell me that. But if it's, I think something should be done better, I don't like the way this is done, I don't want to hear about your criticism, because now you've just handed me one more problem to deal with. I don't care, or I might care, but I'm not going to have bandwidth for it. So please at least give some thought to a solution. And so, following my own advice, I had a very poignant moment. I was in London working foreign exchange, as it happens, helping them fix some international issue. And I was in a hotel room in London, 5 hours ahead of New York, and I had a very young child. And I called home to kind of comfort her. She didn't understand why Daddy couldn't be home. Right, so I'm out earning a crust, and then I hang up that phone call and I turn on the TV for God knows what reason, and there's candidate Obama excoriating the rich and saying that anyone who earns over a certain amount should pay more and more than their fair share, which always seems to be someone else's money, not his. And I just thought, well, this is absolute madness, right? That you've got a spendthrift government that does nothing but spend and spend and spend. There used to be a difference in the country. There used to be Republicans and Democrats, and Democrats would argue for labor and they would try to squeeze more concessions out of capital owners, and Republicans would fight for the rights of capital and defend the sound dollar and the rest of it. But they've been on a bipartisan spending orgy for decades now. And I realized that, my complaint about the distortions caused by multiple layers of American government, which destroy markets, which destroy lives, were sound. It's highly reasoned. But if I were going to say something about it, I should present a solution. And I began to write a version of the federal budget that I thought would make sense for everyone. And as it turns out, it took me a lot longer to complete than I thought, but also it highlighted for me exactly the problem that everyone needs to pay attention to. You'd think in a world full of voluminous writings about the government, right? Democrats write nasty books about Trump and Reagan, and their readers love it and get happy, and vice versa. Or someone will write a very smart expose of why the Veterans Administration doesn't work or why this department doesn't work. And I realized, I have read a lot of them, and they're all very, very succinct, written from all sorts of political perspectives. I realized that what was lacking is no one had bothered, because you just take a point, you just point to HUD and why that's bad, housing and urban development, or you just point to labor and why that is good or bad and how that should be funded. It's only a piece of the puzzle. If you don't present a complete picture and say, here is what the overall fiscal picture of the United States looks like, here's how the government is funded, here are all the surprising things that Americans will find out their government does that they are startled to find out the government does, and wishes the government didn't do. Never mind all the things that people mistakenly believe the government does and just completely and utterly fails to do. I realized that the only way to present this was to present it holistically, but also in detail. So I've gone through every single line item of the federal budget. I've gone through every department, when it was founded, who founded it, and why. Half of them were, or not half, a good chunk of them were funded and created as an experiment, and which made me roar with laughter, because as Milton Friedman said, there's nothing in this world nearly so permanent as a temporary government program. So, book is almost done. It's with my final readers right now, and I am excited to get all of the feedback, both vitriolic, which will mean I've hit a nerve, and positive.
I think it sounds like a fascinating project altogether. I mean, it's a really, really interesting topic. So can you share with us, one or two of these exciting issues that are in Messina's federal budget that we might not know about?
You bet. Well, I mean, one of the core principles that I went through is that simple is always better, right? And simplicity and clarity are the enemies of the administrative state. And by the administrative state, I mean that entire government apparatus that has grown up post-World War II, comprised mainly of non-elected officials, not unaccountable officials, faceless officials. And this is not unique to the US, but I'm only focusing on my nation. Hundreds of thousands of rules and regulations that you don't even know about that will land you in jail, right? I mean, Harry Silverglate wrote one of his great books about 3 felonies a day that you just living your life can run afoul and do run afoul of the law constantly. And you'd be surprised to find this out, right? So one of the core tenets of the book is got a few very simple organizing principles that are applicable to every single department, every single expenditure, every single law that would be creative. I quote Penn Jillette, who's one of my favorite philosopher comedians or magicians. As he says, using Occam's razor, if you're in a society that if you don't want to punish someone who's done nothing wrong, why do you want to reward someone who's done nothing right? Right. So in that instance, right now, we've got immediate term distortions, like the government shut down the economy for no reason whatsoever because of a bad flu season. And then because they shut the economy down, then they thought, well, that's great. Well, now we could perfect our ideal of having people be completely beholden to the state. And so now we're going to start writing them checks. And if you get unemployment, well, on top of the state unemployment you get, we're going to give you another $600 a week. Well, all of a sudden, $600 a week plus the state unemployment you get might well have been more than you made anyway, right? So you got all these people who are not going back to work. You got across the country, restaurants and others who are opening up, who are trying to find employees, and they literally can't find employees because sitting at home on your couch playing Fortnite and drinking beer is more remunerative than getting a job again. So that's one great instance where the distortions are happening in real time and everyone can see it. But the others, go back to housing and urban development, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the creation of the 2007-2008 crisis, which the moment it happened, the apologists for politicians and the media went into overdrive with this nonstop mantra of bankers, right? But that had nothing to do with it. Bankers are greedy. That's in their DNA. So what? If you didn't have the accelerant of free money from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac pouring onto the bonfire, Congress demanding that people lend to people with bad credit, right? You would never have had this in the first place. And the American public is further insulated from those decisions because if you put your money in a bank and the bank failed, you'd be really, really careful about what bank you put your money into. But when the federal government created the FDIC at the end of the Depression, all of a sudden Americans who are saving their own money are divorced from the consequences of bankers' actions. So the bankers are forced by Congress to lend money to people who can't pay it back, or else they're going to get in trouble and they're going to have someone stand in front of their bank with a placard accusing them of bad things. The people who should care, right? The savings that you have worked hard for that is now being lent or given to people who can't pay it back. Well, you don't really care because the FDIC is going to give you your money, whether that loan works out or not. So the book on the whole goes through point by point why each federal program each idea that's put forward, each time they spend your money, is a distortion of how markets should work. And like any eruption, it always blows up. It may take a while. And when it happens, if you're not paying attention, which is what they count on, then you're not going to tie the eruption and the bad symptom to the original cause in the first place. And so, you know, I went through the effort of going down this rabbit hole, and it's kind of like writing a PhD dissertation, I gather, in that there are endless sources, and I eventually had to say no mas and just finish the thing. And hopefully it is comprehensive enough with enough detail. My goal is that you as an American citizen, if God willing, you agree entirely with my proposal about how the government should be funded, you can put on a 3x5 card to your congressman, I support Messina's proposals. You can pick and choose if you want, but I wanted to have something that was actionable and useful, and not just one more book that would make one segment of the population happy with righteous rage and a burst of adrenaline, say that's awful, and the other one ignore. I wrote it so that hopefully across the political spectrum, everyone will at least read it.
Well, there you go. And you've got your bumper sticker all ready to go. Presumably you're printing a few million of those before you get out there. Won't be any rare earths required for a bumper sticker, I don't think. They're one of the few things you can manage to make. Not yet, but they're one of the few things you may read. Yeah, well, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, especially the way government spends money. I mean, a few trillion here, a few trillion there, and sooner or later, you're going to be talking real money. It's just incredible. And that's the comment. Good to hear your insights, Christopher Messina, says one of our LinkedIn viewers this evening. Thank you all for your different comments. I've got a super comment as well from Lynn Palmer, Lynn A. Palmer Jr. Good evening, sir. Great to see you this evening. Christopher is spot on. No one is returning to work. They're better off sitting at home and collecting. Yes, it's incredible, as you say. I mean, the country is now one of professional Twitch players. They don't even have to turn the Twitch on because they get enough money without managing to look for anybody to watch them while they're playing Fortnite and drinking beer. Exactly. And what was the thing? There's a great anecdote I saw the other day where there's a McDonald's somewhere in the middle of, I can't remember where, it was paying $50 a time if you'll just turn up for an interview, and they still can't get any takers.
Crazy.
I mean, that is hashtag first world problems writ large, I've got to say. It's
crazy.
It's just amazing. So what are the best ways? I mean, okay, you're going to provoke a lot of thought when this book comes out, and it's hopefully going to come out in a few weeks' time. When you look at Messina's budget, and therefore, you know, the man from messy times, when you're creating whatever's going to be the messages that you're pushing forward, and it sounds like many, how do you try to rectify something like this?
In terms of, sorry, how do I rectify it?
Well, how do you rectify the government being just an out of control machine that's unaccountable and spends so much money?
It really has to be, people have to wake up. You know, the thing that I found so utterly fascinating is that, and this is where my helpful anthropology degree comes in, right? There's nothing to not understand about the last few years. There is a group in this country that bizarrely believes that everything will be great if an all-powerful government just gives you stuff. Oddly, it's never worked anywhere, but they somehow think this magically this time they're going to get it right. And you've got another group that you know, believes in this apparently antiquated ideal of individual rights, responsibilities, and freedom. And it's not an accident whatsoever, right? I give credit where credit is due. And a good friend of mine who grew up with Bill Ayers outside Chicago, there's no accident. I mean, the left chose, as a result of the turmoil in the 60s, to take a page from the Society of Jesus in the Catholic Church, the Jesuits, who decided they were going to transform the world through education. Right? If you can get in at every level, from nursery school to college, and promulgate a worldview that's not objective, that is completely agenda driven, you're going to achieve results. Now, when people like me, there are others who were making this argument 20, 25 years ago, and I refer to them as the draft dodger generation, right? In a sense of, one of the core things that's interesting in a lot of anthropological study of many societies is that there are transition ceremonies to adulthood. And those can vary wildly across societies. But in the West, what happened in the 60s in America, we had this very odd idea that for the first time ever, first time ever, when there was a draft for military service to go serve in Vietnam, the decision was made for some insane reason that if you happen to be studying in college, you get to defer your showing up for your draft appointment. So rich kids whose parents could afford this instantly shoved them off to college, whether they were going to go to college or not. Now it's time to go to college, right? So now you're in college. 4 years later, the war's still going on. Oh, man. So now I got to pay for my son to get a master's degree. What do you mean the war's still going on? This is nuts. When is this going to end? So now he's in a PhD program. So from a anthropological societal perspective, those people that dodged that responsibility never became adult men. I'm sure that's going to irritate a lot of people, but it's entirely true. So from a societal perspective, they never became adult men, and they thought like children their entire lives. And because they thought like children their entire lives, they welcomed goofy, childish ideas like Marxism, which only anyone who's never worked in the real world could ever believe is true. And they have now spent a good 40 or 50 years promulgating this nonsense through our universities. And for those of us who criticized this 20 years ago, we were told that we were nuts and we were paranoid and this couldn't manufacture. Well, what do you think the last summer was about? Or people getting canceled on Twitter? You know, when we were kids, we were taught by adults, and then children reinforced it. If you whined because someone called you a name, they told you, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you, right? That was internalized. Now, words are violence, and kids need trigger warnings, and they need to be protected from bad thoughts. All of that is horrifying, and all of that is in the service of pushing a centralizing statist agenda where you listen to and are protected by mommy nanny state. And they've done it. They've done a startling, phenomenal good job. And until people stand up and say, I'm pointing that out for the nonsense it is, it will only get worse.
For those of you who are with us this evening, ladies and gentlemen, with the man from Messy Times, Christopher Messina, who are suffering a trigger warning, well, you probably want to look away right now because you can get a whole new extra hour of this kind of discussion where I was the guest of the Messy Times podcast. So therefore, you've got Patrick L. Young being vaguely asked the questions and managing to get onto his high horse and talk about these sorts of things. And of course, therefore, that gives us a perspective, as you can see coming through your social media window as you're watching this right now, ladies and gentlemen. The man from Messy Times, Christopher Messina, he's with us this evening, and his podcast is an excellent listen. I thoroughly recommend it. And you can catch me, yours truly, Patrick L. Young, as one of his very recent guests with a show we recorded just last week.
It was
Colin
awesome.
Howard. Yeah, it was awesome altogether. It was absolutely fantastic. We discussed, well, technology, freedom, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, issues to do with the Ottomans, and that was just in the warm-up. I mean, then we got really stuck into things, which were quite splendid. Thank you very, very much, Colin Howard, for your excellent question. Colin, as I was mentioning a couple of moments ago, was a guest on our previous show talking about individual identity and all those sorts of digital threats to our privacy. Brilliant, but Christopher is bound to be cancelled by the Woke Brigade, which I suppose is why you're in the People's Republic of Florida, hoping that your governor is going to protect you, if not the other man who's seeking refuge from the Washington, D.C. How much want to start with? Colossus. Yeah, that's exactly right. And quite fascinating altogether. So you're talking about this and all of these sorts of things that have been triggered. We've got a great comment coming up, actually, from our correspondent this evening in Belgium, who was worrying about global warming in Florida earlier on. Jeffrey Eisenberg, I'm getting a copy of Christopher's book, The Messina Budget, as a conversation source for diners. When I'm having dinner with my American friends, there are quite some similarities with Belgian government spending. Indeed, the Belgian government, memorable for the fact that the one time it came out of recession was during the time when they couldn't actually manage to form a government. The economy managed to balance itself and emerge without any intervention whatsoever during the course of, and that's only the course of the last 15, 20 years, isn't it? Well, of course, Belgium, I mean, it has many layers of bureaucracy, least of which is the European Union. And we'd love to say something positive about their impact on society. But instead, I'm going to go back to Christopher Messina and say, well, thank you very, very much for all the comments, ladies and gentlemen. If you'd like to ask a question, we're coming into our last 12 minutes of the show this evening. We're with Chris Messina. He's in sunny Florida, in the heart of the United States of America. So, Chris, I mean, you've written this book. You're obviously priming yourself for some exciting and challenging discussions. You're saying you're getting the feedback coming now. What are you hoping to achieve from the book?
You know, it's funny. When I began the book, I think I began it the way a lot of people who write about government do, right? Most people, if you're having a delightful day, you don't say, you know what, I'm going to sit down and tell everyone about my delightful day. That's an odd thing to do. You just go about your day and have another drink by the pool. A lot of people who write about governmental issues or policy issues, they're driven by a personal agenda, moral agenda, whatever. And my first impulse was exactly that I wanted to kind of, get all this off my chest, and I wanted to express it. I realized, but there are plenty of books that have been written about that, and it's got limited utility. What I truly hope for this is it provides a common framework for everyone to argue about, right? Senator Moynihan years ago, and talk about being prescient. He's the one that first said, you're welcome to your own opinions. You're not welcome to your own facts. And we have lived in a fact-free zone for I don't know how long now. I mean, everything I hear people say, people cannot distinguish between news and editorial anymore. And I think this all goes back to the root cause. I think this is deliberate. I mean, the miseducation of the American public, the replacement of objective knowledge with propaganda has borne fruit, right? With the moment they start, I remember being in grammar school, asking, what is social studies? Are we studying history? What are we studying, right? What is this? And it's become even more prominent now. So going back to root causes, going back to principles of personal freedom and personal responsibility that go hand in hand. People can't even tell what a right is anymore. You hear people, politicians, many of them terrifyingly in federal office, who say things like healthcare is a right, housing's a right. Let's be really clear. Anything someone else has to provide to you cannot be a right. I posit in the book a thought experiment. Statistical studies, epidemiological studies show that amazingly enough, young men between 16 and 35 are less prone to violence if they're able to get a massage once a week and get to run around the track for 40 hours or something, right? Well, running around the track, you could well be a right? You're allowed to go outside and run. No one's going to stop you. But getting a massage, which will calm your muscles down, can't be a right because someone else has to give it to you, right? Unless you create a robot. So the thing that I found so disturbing is at basic level, there's a bunch of people in this country and others that have tried to distort ground truth. They've tried to end people's understanding of what is rational, what's a right, what's a responsibility, what's an option, what does freedom mean. And they have managed to do so appallingly well. I mean, we in Florida got lucky because Ron DeSantis is the governor. So he looked at the statistics coming out of Italy as recent as February of 2020 and realized correctly that old people are at risk. So he shut all the nursing homes and didn't allow anyone in unless they'd been tested. At the same time, the American media and the Democrats' hero, Andrew Cuomo in New York, was busy sending old people back into nursing homes who were infected with the COVID-19 virus while there was a hospital ship sitting in the New York harbor, sitting empty, that the Navy had sent. The media still praises him. They refuse to call for his ouster, even after 20-something women have come forward with pretty solid allegations of misconduct in office towards them. And this is the same group that howled and screamed at Brett Kavanaugh when he was about to become Supreme Court justice after they'd tried everything they could to disqualify him. And they came up with some woman who can't remember the year some alleged assault happened, but all that became perfectly justifiable and he should be thrown out of office. And so the same people that are promulgating this nonsense then wonder why when Americans are polled, 90 something percent don't trust what they see in the quote unquote news. It's madness, absolute madness.
But it's interesting, isn't it, though, because you talk about people not trusting the news and you talk about the desire of the news media to push people back. And then, of course, the United Kingdom, they recently had Brexit, and everybody who thought that they could control all of the great unwashed were suddenly shocked because people had an opinion, and that opinion didn't actually involve spending your life on Eurostar or paying fealty to Brussels for the rest of your days. And people sort of like their own independence.
Absolutely. And what again, I praise Ron DeSantis because he's rational, right? And when everyone else is calling and screaming for how do we shut down, you got this governor in California, this lunatic in Michigan, who is busy, micromanaging things to the point where, like, you're allowed to go to Home Depot, but you're only allowed to buy toilet paper. You're not allowed to buy garden seeds or paint. Well, I'm demanding you stay at home. By the way, no one's allowed to go boating, but only a certain kind of boat. And someone at a marina near her house found her husband putting a boat in the water. Like, craziness. And DeSantis just refused all that to happen. And the reason I said in some ways we got lucky is he only won the last election by a fairly thin margin. And last heard, his competitor in that election was busy doing meth with prostitutes in a motel on the beach in northern Florida, right? So thank heavens that we got lucky and we got DeSantis in office, because Florida's path would have been incredibly different had the meth head been in office. It's just, that sort of chance terrifies me.
Well, obviously, unfortunately, our time here is only temporary. Wish we were under the state and we could manage to extend time at all points in time like temporary government departments. Or indeed, given that Colin Howard is watching this evening, I have to add the 3-month-long temporary 1960s 70-mile-an-hour speed limit in the UK. It is, seems to be still going, which is a lot of trimesters later. Great question actually just come in from Martin Watkins. Good evening, Martin. We missed you last week. Sorry you couldn't make it. Christopher, very insightful. I am intrigued as to who has the mandate to decide who gets what rights. If left to popular opinion, we could be in for a bumpy ride.
Absolutely, Martin, spot on. And that's part of what I address in the book, is that good sound Republican government does not mean that whoever happens to be in the majority at the moment gets to write the rules, which is what we're getting now. It requires a commitment on behalf of all of society to understand there are some things that are inalienable rights. And it's a very slippery slope, right? Because part of the major headache, Lenin used to say it, that the bourgeoisie are going to sell us the rope with which we hang them. Right? So you've got this very difficult issue, which hopefully we're not encountering. But that's always a fear in any sort of democratically elected society. If you have a party get into power, that the next thing they do is change the rules of the game so significantly that the revolution becomes permanent. You don't have a free society anymore. And it's a nebulous thing, and it's far more fragile than most people realize. And you look at the fact that Venezuela and Argentina 100 years ago had better credit ratings and stronger economies than the United States does currently. There is nothing to say that this great American prosperity will continue. In fact, you've got a polar opposite vision on the other side of the world that thinks we're absolute idiots for allowing something as important as government to be put to a popular vote. They think it's absolutely nuts. And based on recent results, they might be right. But the problem with enlightened despotism, of course, is it ends up being not that enlightened. And I will choose the messiness of the occasional misfire on democratically elected governments over an all-powerful authoritarian regime. But that's the clarion call of the book, is that the United States, in many senses, again, I'm not opining on other countries at the moment, has become a statist authoritarian regime. When the government throws Navy veterans in jail for daring to dam a small rivulet on his mountain property because the EPA decides that violates the Clean Water Act, that is a government that is out of control. And it is by chance that any one of us are not in jail. And that is how dictatorships run. And I can be the canary in the coal mine, or people can think I'm nuts. But the country is in a very bad place. I don't think it's irrecoverable. But I do think that people need to get re-engaged really carefully. The fact that we have incredibly low turnout in local elections and federal elections. I mean, de Blasio was elected the first time. 12% of New Yorkers bothered to show up to vote. Well, in that instance, people with a bad agenda who are focused on seizing power are far more able to seize power than if everybody was engaged and listened and bothered to vote accordingly. That's my message, right? Get engaged, spend a little time on government.
So it's saying get engaged, spend a little time in government. Actually, Lynn Palmer's made 2 comments here. It's one extended comment he's making. Hi, hello again, Lynn. So Christopher, do you feel people therefore are actually, if not turning up to vote, they're voting with their feet? I mean, Michigan, New York, California, all losing congressional seats, and indeed Florida and Texas gaining seats. And indeed, yep. I have to say, I've had, I think, a paucity of calls with New York in the course of the last number of months. Everybody I know from Chicago, from Michigan, from New York, from the tri-state area, they're all in Florida. I mean, it must be like Bangladesh down there at the moment.
1,000 additional people a day are flooding in, and it is a phenomenal place to live. It's been a delight. We came down 8 years ago in reaction to Blasio getting elected. I said, no mas, I'm done with this nonsense. Not only am I paying the highest costs in the country, but I'm not thanked for it. Oh, no. The mayor's telling me, in fact, I owe more in some nebulous way. I should pay more in some way. Craziness, but come to a rational place, but get involved. I mean, I hope to high heaven that the people who come down here voting with their feet don't continue to vote the way they did where they were, because that's what got those places into that mess in the first place.
Now that is a very interesting point at which I think we're going to draw things to a conclusion, because we've come to a rational place, and indeed we've been in a rational place, I think, ladies and gentlemen, for the course of the last hour and a minute or two, talking with Christopher Messina, the host of the Messy Times podcast. He's a man of rare earths, which is a fascinating and interesting topic we hit upon earlier on. He's the man of Messina's Budget, coming soon, a fascinating book, and I'm looking forward to the seemingly endless number of listicles that can manage to emerge from that are going to tell us terrible things about the excesses and foibles of the government of the United States of America, whether in temporary offices or indeed the very few things that are actually permanent. We've heard a call for perhaps the idea that the supposedly permanent Federal Reserve might be temporary as a result of how it's been behaving over the course of the last few years. Interesting discussions on freight and other matters. I think it's fascinating that you look at the idea of, yes, a $32 trillion American federal debt, 120 trillion of deficits and debts held by the citizenry overall, and somehow or other the Federal Reserve believes that it's going to hold back the tide of inflation. Maybe I'm biased because I've got my gold tie on again this evening, but nonetheless it strikes me there could be very messy times in the future. If you'd like some messy times in the future, don't forget to check out Anchor. I do believe it's Anchored FM is the place where you can get all of the Messy Times podcasts, particularly my conversation just from recorded last week with Christopher Messina. Messina's federal budget, you'll have to hold back for the time being. It's going to be in stores soon. You'll be able to buy that copy of the book, which also shows you, I'm not sure which particular member of the board of the Federal Reserve you were wrestling on the back cover there, but certainly some beasts are not going to find it particularly palatable in your calls for a slightly more organized government. Only remains for me to say thank you very much to our guest, Christopher Messina. Great to see you once again. A fabulous conversation altogether. I hope you'll be back again soon. Thank you to everybody who engaged during the course of this evening. So thank you, Jeffrey Eisenberg from Brussels, or at least from Belgium, David Finn, Randy Kowalski, Chris Pryor-Williard, also Lynn A. Palmer Jr. for your various interactions, LinkedIn users, there were several of you, Martin Watkins and Colin Howard, who are, of course, also alumni of this show. Give us a like before you switch off on social media this evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick L. Young. I want to say thank you very much to the magnificent service in the gallery from our production team this evening of Beata and Jamil. Thanks to our showrunner, Ola, for her work in putting together this production. You can catch my pith again tomorrow in Exchange Invest, the daily newsletter. The business of bourses will be writ large. Christopher Messina, I wish you a very exciting and profitable rare earth future. It's been an absolutely terrific show once again. The man from Messy Times will return, both in his own podcast and I believe on an IPO-VID in the not too distant future. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Patrick L. Young. Have a great week in life and markets. We're going to be back next week with Max Ganado, a legal eagle from Malta, one of the geniuses behind the Blockchain Island strategy as was originally created. Christopher Messina, this has been a great show. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and good day to you wherever you are in the world.